Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to get started right away so we can get out maybe a little early, so see first pitch. So a question came up last time about why the weighted averages, or why the mean and median of the weighted averages were below any of the weighted averages of the problem sets of the exams. So I thought that was a very interesting question, and I actually did discover the answer to that. So for the problem set, the two problem sets in the exams, I did not include any scores of people who didn't turn them in. So if you didn't turn in problem set number 1, you would have gotten a 0 on it. Or if you didn't turn in problem set number 2, you'd get a 0 on it. But I didn't include those zeros in the means and medians. So that pushed, obviously, the means and medians of those up. But if you took exam 1, all of those scores, if you even had a 0 on problem sets 1 and 2, would still be included in the weighted average, because the weighted average is based on problem sets 1, 2, and the exam. So as long as you took the exam, I included your problem set 1 and 2 scores, even if it was a 0 because you didn't turn it in. Hopefully, you didn't get a 0 because you did turn it in and you just did a really lousy job. But, so anyway, that's the explanation for why those are different. So today, we're going to finish up on tariffs, and then talk about a couple of other barriers to imports, import quotas, voluntary export restraints, and that's easy for me to say, a mismatch of other types of barriers that exist out there as well. So the first thing we will, yes? Only yours. So you must not have been here last time, or you came late last time. So I'll tell you what, why don't you listen to the podcast, the first 5 minutes of the podcast from Thursday. Okay, so again, what we want to see here is that a tariff, we know, is going to raise the price of the imported good. Right? And it also allows the domestic producer to raise their prices as well. Because in the marketplace, the imported good and the domestically produced good are going to sell for exactly the same price. So the domestic price rises whenever we have a tariff. This is, of course, the whole purpose of a tariff, is to allow the domestic producer to be able to raise their price because they'll be under less competitive pressure from foreign imports. So that's exactly what we want to see. So one of the things, though, that we would like to figure out is exactly how much protection is being provided to the domestic producer. Right? How much? Okay, we know it's protection, but the question is how much. We can figure that out in a very simple way just by calculating some percentages, which is the way we would normally define that. If it's an ad valorem tariff, if it's a 5% tariff, then it makes sense to think of, well, gee, it sounds like 5% protection, because it's going to raise the domestic price, at least relative to the world price, by 5%. If it's a specific tariff, $5 per 100 value, then we can just convert that to a percentage term as well.
I have a question about the ad valorem, how that's put in practice. Is that added onto the retail price in the store? Is it added onto the wholesale that's imported?
It's typically added. So the question was, what price is the ad valorem tariff added to? And it's the imported price. So it's added by, once the good comes, whatever the price is in the world market, whatever the shipping costs, when it lands in the port, that's where the tariff gets applied. So if it's, there are lots of other things to add on to the price beyond that, transportation costs, marketing costs, all the retail overheads and those types of things. So this is not necessarily the final selling price of the good. Now, these simple calculations we have to be a little bit careful about, because if the large country case is true, we're also driving down the world price as well as driving up the domestic price. So we would have to take into consideration that. The other issue, which turns out to be much more important or interesting from our perspective, is what happens when tariffs are applied at different stages of production in the life cycle of coming up with a finished good. So one of the things that globalization has done in this round of globalization, that is the 1990s and 2000s, as opposed to earlier rounds of globalization 100 years ago or 140 years ago, is that we've really distributed out the production processes. So for instance, an Apple iPhone, there are parts of an Apple iPhone that are made in something like 45 different countries, which seems like an incredibly complicated distribution stream to me, but they seem to know what they're doing. So we need to think about how goods move between countries and what would happen if some of the inputs, the parts, have tariffs associated with them, rather than just a tariff on the final good when it comes into a country. So we're going to take an example where we have two countries. We'll call them Thailand and Indonesia. We're going to assume we have one final good, and it's going to be an automobile. And just for yucks, we'll assume that it sells for $8,000. Nobody said it had a floorboard or smog control or anything else. So we've got an automobile that sells for $8,000. This automobile is going to be made from a bunch of intermediate parts, right? Intermediate goods, auto parts. And we'll assume that those auto parts cost $6,000. Now, we're also going to call these auto parts a primary good. So we don't have to worry about, well, we need iron ore to make steel, to make metal castings to make this, or we need rubber trees and synthetic chemicals to make rubber parts to do this. We're just going to say auto parts cost $6,000. Okay? So now, let's suppose that Indonesia has an auto parts industry, but it would like to have an auto assembly industry. Right? So they're making the parts, but they'd like to be able to actually assemble the automobiles. Wages are much higher in the auto assembly industry than they are in the auto parts industry, which might be one of the reasons that you would want to do that. But notice, with free trade, domestic assembly can only take place in Indonesia if they can do it for $2,000 or less. Right? We have a $10,000 car. We have, $8,000 car. We have an $8,000 car, and the parts cost $6,000. Right? So the value added in auto assembly is the $2,000. If you need $3,000 to assemble it, you would have to charge $9,000 for the car. But in a world market, you can buy a car for $8,000, so it's not likely you're going to get much business. So again, we need to be able to assemble it for $2,000 or less. Now, in order to get the industry started, let's suppose that Indonesia imposes a 25% tariff on imported cars. Okay? So now, with a tariff, domestic assemblers can charge up to $10,000 for their car in Indonesia, only in Indonesia, not on the world market. Okay? So now, we have $8,000 car, 25% tariff, that's $2,000 per car, so they can charge, the price of a car essentially goes to $10,000 inside Indonesia. So now notice that with this tariff, we can assemble this car as long as we can do it for under $4,000, not the $2,000 that it required with free trade. So when we think about what we call the effective rate of protection, the effective rate of protection of a 25% tariff is actually 100% in this case. So where does 100% come from? Notice that the value added in Indonesia with the tariff, we can assemble cars for $4,000. Before the tariff, or without the tariff, free trade, we had to have a value added of $2,000. So if we took that difference, the increase in the value added that's being offered to the Indonesia auto assembly industry relative to the world price, value added at the world price, comes out to $2,000 on a base of $2,000, which is 100%. So notice that the effective rate of protection is substantially above the sort of nominal or stated rate of the tariff itself. So in this case, domestic Indonesian auto assemblers really getting a lot of leeway in terms of having this tariff in place. Now, it is important to remember that this only works for cars that are going to be assembled and sold in Indonesia. They don't get to assemble them in Indonesia and then sell them on the world market. Banking them at 10 grand just doesn't really work. Okay, now let's take the other example, though. Let's suppose that Thailand already has an auto assembly industry. Thailand has an auto assembly industry, but rather than buying stuff from Indonesia, which just put a 25% tariff on their cars, they want to start an auto parts industry. So now what we see happening is we'll put a 10% tariff. So with free trade, our auto parts were 6 grand. With the tariff, they now become 6,600. So because the value added is the full amount of the full price of the auto parts, this is why we call it a primary good. We don't have to worry about other components coming into it. We can easily calculate the effective rate of protection as 6,600, the value added with the tariff, minus the value added at free trade, as a percent of the value added at free trade. Well, in this case, that's just 10%. So in this particular case, where we're talking about primary goods, or we're talking about tariffs on goods that we don't have to worry about earlier stages of production, the effective rate of protection is exactly equal to the tariff rate. But now we also want to ask ourselves, what happens to the auto assembly industry? So notice that in the auto assembly industry, with free trade, we're going to assemble cars as long as we can do it for under $2,000. But with the tariff, now we have to make sure that assembly can be done for under $1,400. Right? As an assembler, I've got to pay that extra $600, that extra 10% on the parts. But in a world market, I can't change the price of the car that I'm selling at. So I'm still selling it at $8,000. The parts are costing me more. Obviously, the value added that I need to have in order to be able to stay in the assembly business is actually getting squeezed. So in this case, notice, we get a negative rate of protection in auto assembly. So here, thought I had another pen. So here we end up with a negative rate of protection. So we can figure this out. So notice the value added, the value added with the tariff now has to be $1,400. But in free trade, we could do this assembly at $2,000. So when we look at that as a percentage of the free trade value added, we see that we're looking at minus 600 on 3,000, which is on 2,000, which is a minus 30%. So you've provided some protection to the auto parts industry, which you're trying to get going, but you've taken protection away, or you've actually made it harder to assemble cars in Thailand. So when a country puts on tariffs, it has to be very careful about what stage of production it's trying to protect, and recognizing that by providing protection at earlier stages of production, you're actually harming later stages of production because you're increasing their costs. So it probably doesn't come as a terrible surprise that if you put a tariff on imported steel or aluminum, then you're going to be hurting the auto industry or the appliance industry, which uses a lot of steel and aluminum in the manufacturing of their products. Right? You've increased their cost. If they can't raise their final price, now all of a sudden you've squeezed their margins. So one has to be very careful about where the tariffs are actually placed and how they come about. So overall, this is the formula for finding the effective rate of protection. So it's the value added with the tariff in place minus the value added at the world price divided by whatever the value added was at the world price times 100. So that'll give us a way then of measuring what our effective rates of protection actually are. It turns out that in most cases, the effective rates of protection are typically much higher than the actual stated rates. And the reason for that is that we typically put on effective rates of protection at later stages of production rather than earlier stages of production. Question?
If we're a country that is economically significant and we change the world price with a tariff, then which world price would we put in the calculation?
The pre-tariff price.
Even though after the price of comes down, okay.
Yes, we would still do that because what we're trying to compare is how much protection are we providing relative to a free trade situation. So we want to look at the value added in free trade and then the value added that we're adding in with the tariff. Now remember, the value added that you're putting with the tariff in place is the price you get to charge minus the free trade price, which that free trade price will now be the new world price. So the value added here is the domestic price with the tariff minus the world price after the tariff has been put into place. These two, call this A, and these two B, are the pre-tariff world prices. Okay. Any other questions on effective rates of protection? Okay, good. Well, let's talk about import quotas then. So we saw last time when we talked about tariffs that a tariff was a tax that we placed on imported goods. An import quota, and one of the things that we saw about the tariff is that it would reduce the volume of imports that we have. And it does that in part by the tax, of course, which raises the domestic price, which reduces the domestic quantity demanded. An import tariff works by not imposing a tax, but actually having a restriction imposed by the government on the volume of imports that can come into the country. So notice that you can raise the tax and reduce the volume of imports, or you can say, we're just going to import a certain amount. Now, as you might expect, why did I do it this way? Okay. As you might expect, when you reduce the volume of imports by government edict, you're also going to raise the price of imported goods. Right? So we're going to restrict it at the old price. Quantity demanded would exceed quantity supplied, which will push the price of the product up. Now, we have to ask ourselves, how does the government actually go about restricting those imports? Well, the first thing that they do is they issue import licenses to somebody and somehow. So an import license gives somebody or some firm the legal right to bring imported goods into the country or to send imported goods into the country. So let me skip ahead here because these licenses can actually be held by a wide variety of folks. Domestic individuals or business firms, mostly business firms, as you might expect. We can also assign the import licenses to foreign governments, who then in turn can assign them to individual businesses or individuals within their country. And then finally, the licenses can be assigned not by going through the foreign government, but by going directly to foreign individuals or foreign firms. Again, most of the time it's business firms, not individuals that are involved in here, but there are some exceptions. As you might expect, owning one of those licenses has value. Right? I now have the right to buy products at the world market and to sell them inside the domestic market at what will now be a higher price. So that earns me a profit. And that profit turns out to be something that we call a quota rent. A quota rent. Okay. So if we thought about the difference between a tariff and an import quota, where both reduce the volume of imports from exactly the same amount to exactly the same amount, right? So we're going to we got to figure out the right tariff to reduce imports from 100 million units to 75 million units. And then we also want to see for an import quota, let's just have an import quota of 75 million. So as long as the demand and supply curves look the same, the price has to rise by the same amount. In the case of a tariff, the government, of course, receives the revenue, the volume of the volume of imports times the tariff rate. That tariff revenue will be identical in amount to the quota rents that are being earned. So it doesn't particularly matter which way you go, tariffs or import quotas, except that tariff revenue goes directly to the government. Quota rents may go to the government, but don't necessarily go to the government. Okay, so how are these quota licenses actually distributed? Well, governments have very peculiar ways of doing this. One way is to just first come, first serve. Who's in the business? Come up. What do you want? And that happens occasionally, but is not terribly frequent. A second way of assigning the license is, I'll tell you what, I'm the government, you have one, oh, you can have one too, and I'll give you one, or no, I'll give you three. I just assign them out, right? Just give them away. And a third way that the government can do it is to actually auction them off, right? They have value, so how much are you paying for it, right? So those are the three ways. And in general, the governments either generally auction them off or give them away. So we'll talk about the implications of that here in just a second. So let's think about the small country case first. So in the subsequent slide, I actually use the U.S. So again, remember, when we talk about a small country, we're simply talking about a country whose trade in some particular item, in this case our imports of some particular item, would be relatively small compared to the rest of the world. So I'll give you an example. In the United States, we have import quotas on peanuts. We are actually a very small importer of peanuts in terms of the rest of the world's trade in peanuts. So let's just work with that example. The import quota itself is going to, like a tariff, drive a wedge between the prices in the domestic market, where it raises the prices, but it will have no effect on the world price, right? Small country. Notice this could be the same slide that we used from last week, or last time, except we generally call the import quota price PIQ. So here's our initial situation, and let's suppose that we decide that we will impose an import quota of M1, right? Less than what we had before. Because this is less, this is what is sometimes referred to as a binding quota. Occasionally, the government, in its great efficiencies, creates an import quota that's larger than the free trade imports, which is referred to as a non-binding quota, because nobody cares, you're still only going to import the free trade amount. But it does happen on occasions. Okay, so this is our binding quota, and notice we can figure out exactly what happens. At this quota and the original world price, notice we now have excess demand for peanuts, or whatever this might be. So the price is going to rise in the domestic country, and it will rise until we get the market to clear at PIQ.